Well, not that anyone cares, but I do apologize for getting this video out late. I've been sick for over a week now, and it's getting better, but not nearly enough, so we're just gonna power through. I tell you, it was snowing like a week ago. It's plus 25 Celsius outside now. Gotta love this city. I also took the time to color coordinate my nails, my cup, and my outfit, so cheers to that. Whenever I pick up an old sci-fi story, I never know what to expect, because the sci-fi angle is a little bit in the eye of the beholder, because, well, technically, something like Flowers for Algernon is sci-fi, and not a terrible tearjerker that actually is. I picked up The Island of Dr. Moreau without any prior knowledge as to what it is. Worse, I think my mind confused it with Gilligan's Island, which is not even the right medium, and then, oh my god. The book itself is one of those books that you start Googling the historical context like midway through, because you see that there is something there and it's better to have that context like straight away. I may be a total noob here, but I do not think I knew what vivisection was prior to reading this book, and we're not even in the darkest timeline now, are we? It reminded me of that moment when I learned what segregation was. Like, white people used to do that? Like, what? So we will not talk about animal cruelty. It's there, it's nasty. What I'm much more interested in is the human behaviors and like what it tells us about the fears and anxieties of that time period. Because vivisection was going out of fashion already at that point, yes, but why? What were people so afraid of? And what I found interesting is that this story is based almost on the same anxiety as Frankenstein. Mary Shelley was afraid of humans infringing on the divine right of the creation, and here it's kind of similar. Moreau is trying to create something that we have not seen before, and he, just like Frankenstein, doesn't see his creations as their own persons with their own minds and feelings. No, they are simply failed experiments. I love that we used to be afraid of these mad scientists, and now we're afraid of technological moguls, but at least the mad scientists had the degree in what they're doing. But honestly, for the time period, I get it, and especially with actual vivisection going on, I do not blame Wells one bit for jumping straight to monsters. But I do not like the conclusions that he seemingly comes to with it. Especially in the second half of the book, when Pendrick gets stuck on the island with the creatures, and it seemingly is about the loss of humanity, with these creatures serving as proxy, as if left unattended, people will surrender to their most baser instincts and turn into animals almost. Again, it might be true, but I do not like it. I kind of feel the same way about Lord of the Flies, and I think it's kind of a similar message, but I think history has proven that particular piece of fiction wrong, because I think there was an incident when a bunch of kids were stranded, and they were actually collaborative and helping each other survive. So maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't jump straight to the worst possible conclusion, and maybe, just maybe, humanity still stands a chance? Because with that lens on, the book simply reads as fear-mongering. Overall, I do not think that I like the story all that much, so let's move on. Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I realized far too late that I've seen the movie adaptation of this book, and I must have purged it from my mind, because as I remember it, I watched 2 Keira Knightley movies in a row, this one and Atonement. I remember sitting there, covered in snot in tears at the end of Atonement, and I was like, I'm not watching dramas anymore. Only rom-coms from this point on. Because it was the winter break and I didn't want to spend the rest of it depressed. And I looked back on it now, and it was January 2022, about a month before my life went to absolute shit. So if it wasn't a bad omen, I do not know what was. Maybe the tanks at the border with the Ukraine, but who can tell? Anyways, the book. It was written in 2005, and you can definitely feel it. Wiki calls it sci-fi, but it is a YA dystopia, let's be honest with ourselves. I cannot talk about it in detail without revealing major spoilers, so I will assume that you've read the book or seen the movie adaptation. Actually, to be fair, that's something that Ishiguro does really well. The slow kind of reveal of details about this world and what actually is going on. He keeps that suspense and that tension quite nicely for the first half of the book. He doesn't rush it, and it sucks you in. You want to know what's going on, and the clues are there for you. It all falls apart at the end there with a mandatory meeting with the guy in charge who dumps exposition on the main characters, but it is a genre staple now. This is why I call it a YA dystopia. It happens in all of them. I think we can blame The Truman Show for it, actually. I think they might have started it all. Is Truman Show a YA dystopia? Well, it is a dystopia. And I would say that the premise for this particular dystopia is terrifying and something that I can totally see happening in real life, and that makes it even more terrifying. So that perfectly works. What doesn't work is the characters. They are too mellow. They don't want for anything, and maybe that's true for the world that they live in, but it doesn't make for good protagonists. Imagine if Katniss simply allowed her sister to be taken to the Hunger Games because, well, this is how the world works. This is the level of passivity and acceptance of their fate that these characters are at. And while I could scrunch up some sympathy for them, especially once you learn who they are and what's happening to them, it's kind of inevitable, but my investment level was rather low. Especially there at the end, I fully knew that it was not going to work out for them, and the book ends on such hopeless note that does speak to my dry, depressed Russian heart, but is it truly the story? Conformity and acceptance of treatment of others without any resistance whatsoever. That also speaks to my conformist Russian heart, but I do not appreciate being called out like that. Overall, I do not regret reading this book, but I wouldn't call it like top 100 books of the century or whatever Wiki told me this book is. I've never read Somerset Maugham before, and I do not know if Rain was a good entry into his stories, but that's what I got. I really enjoy the setting. I do not think I've read many things before set in the Pacific, especially during the colonization of those islands. And yeah, it is uncomfortable to read about these missionaries and how they talk about the natives, but that's the entire point of the story. I think it is a recurring theme and setting for Maugham. I've now read also another short story called Macintosh, set there as well. But in Rain, specifically, it is the story about a missionary who first boasts about how he's converting the natives to the true religion and the questionable methods that he's using. And then he also tries to convert a fallen European woman as she is disturbing his peace as they're stuck in the same house during a torrential storm. And as I said, I do not think I'm expected to read the missionary and his wife as the good guys. So the entire story has this uncomfortable feeling to it, but it is intentional. We have a POV character, a doctor, who is uncomfortable as well, but not nearly enough. There is something disturbing about the way that he tries to help this woman and how ineffective he is at it. And it works wonderfully with how the story ends in the last lines that she throws in his face. I don't think I should tell you how the story ends in case you haven't read it, but I enjoyed the certain ambiguity with which Maugham lives his story. The story is resolved, but the motives and reasons are left open to interpretation, and I think it works wonderfully here. I would say also now that I've read Macintosh as well, I think that's something that Maugham does, goes out with a bang, as it were. I would also say here that it must have been something rather revolutionary what he does with the missionary in this particular tale. We've now seen many characters like this, so it lost a little bit of punch that it must have had at the time of publication, so there is that as well. The Most, I think, by Jessica Anthony. I sort of like this story. This is a glimpse into a life of a married couple, a day in a life, if you will. They kind of present as this idyllic couple. She is a stay-at-home mom. He works in insurance. They have two wonderful kids. They go to church on Sundays. Picture perfect. But both are really unhappy in life. Both are cheating on each other. And they are reaching the end of the rope here. He is a handsome but lost man who simply followed the path that was right in front of him, ended up with a job that he doesn't like and a wife and kids that he doesn't fully appreciate. She had aspirations of becoming a tennis player, but ended up being this housewife and not even that well off. Both are unfaithful in their own different ways, but we're shown a day when it reaches a boiling point for the both of them and they want to confess, but neither is courageous enough to take the first step. Early in the year, I read Fates and Furies, and it reminded me quite a bit of that. This story is way shorter, so we don't go into as much depth here, but the story is kind of similar. There is this man that is rather unremarkable with a string of affairs that is catching up to him, and a wife who also has secrets of her own. The author also does this thing where she gives us two different perspectives of the same events from his and her viewpoint, and how differently they play out for that. I always enjoy that in a story. The character work is there, even on the smaller amount of pages. We see these personal struggles and how they are not resolved by this picture-perfect marriage. If you are not irked by cheating storylines, there could be something of interest here. The only thing that fell through for me was the wife's motivation for the second affair, if we can call it that. I understood the internal logic, as flawed as it was, for the rest of the affairs, but that one left me hella confused. As most motivations that have to do with sex, to be fair. But what really sold the story to me at the end was the tennis metaphor. There is this move in tennis that's called most, the bridge, I guess, that the tennis instructor teaches the wife at one point. It's about luring your opponent closer and closer to you and then striking. And the wife plays that out metaphorically with the husband as she tries to lure him in and make him confess first. It worked brilliantly for me. It kind of tied the whole story with a nice little bow at the end. I feel like every kid goes through these stages of obsession at one point. Dinosaurs seems to be a universal thing, transcending national borders, but I also think that most post-Soviet kids at one point were obsessed with Greek mythology. I think we read it in school, and my book of the Greek myths is still at my dad's, and that kind of shows you how much I loved it, since it didn't migrate to my brother, as most non-gender toys and books did. Although, to be fair, my brother attended a church school, and he's now in the process of becoming a priest, so maybe he wouldn't have appreciated it as much as I did. With these Greek myth retellings, I'm way late to the party. I think that wave has crested and passed. What's the expression here? I tried to Google it, but I couldn't find it. Whoops. But yes, maybe I should have started with The Son of Achilles, but that book is now banned in Russia, so rather hard to get. Not impossible yet, but rather hard. But here, this is Circe by Madeleine that was just sitting on a shelf in the library, tempting me. Now, I really enjoyed the process of reading this book. It reminded me of the time in my life when I was reading a lot of historical fiction, or pseudo-historical fiction, like Alexandre Dumas had a few books on the kings of France. And it felt like that, a reimagining and retelling of the classical stories that we're all familiar with. I don't remember the Odyssey in a great level of detail. I wanted to reread it recently, but the canonical Russian translation of the Odyssey was done by a poet Vasily Zhukovsky in the 18th century, and it is a beautiful translation, but oh my god, it's pompous, so I couldn't get through a lot of it. So I decided I will track down an English translation and read it that way. Recommend me one if you have a preference. Having said that, I really enjoyed the process of reading this book. It touches on a lot of myths and various relationships within the Greek mythology, but it reframes them or reimagines them or simply puts a different perspective on them while still sticking to the rules of the universe. For example, it might give you a slightly different frame for the creation of Glaucus, but it will stick very much to the rules of inevitability, of fate and prophecies. Or it takes Odysseus himself, who was a hero in his own story, I would imagine, and adds dimension to him and character flaws and fallibility too. I enjoyed that quite a bit. And I enjoyed reading Circe's story as well, especially in the first part. The book lost a lot of steam for me as soon as Odysseus showed up. Circe's motivation flipped to the man in her life even more than it did before, and I found her son annoying, so... The book is packed with events. For all it's named after the protagonist, it is much more plot-driven rather than character-driven. And which is not a bad thing necessarily, it's really fun to read, but it left me rather hollow at the end. Like I watched a popcorn movie that you forget 2 seconds after having left the theater. And it's kind of the same here. I enjoyed reading it, but nothing came out of it. The back cover here says that it is a feminist retelling of the classical myth. And yes, it is feminist in a sense that anything that is not overtly misogynistic, as most Greek myths are, is feminist by default. I was reminded of a book I read a while back, A Heroine's Journey, I think it's called. It's a response to Joseph Campbell, and the author there tried to extract these female stories and their journeys from the shadow of patriarchy where they were created. So it is kind of that, since Homer simply calls Circe an evil sorceress and doesn't provide any additional information, so yeah. Miller adds a lot of detail and texture to Circe, her relationships with her family, with her father, with the Olympians, humans, Odysseus and his family. It is Greek mythology. Everybody's sleeping with everybody. But while that fills the page count and adds a lot of tension and adrenaline almost, like the birth of the Minotaur will do that to you, but in the end, I felt like we didn't explore Circe enough, which is weird. The main theme for her is her otherness. She's not like her father, not like her mother, not like her siblings, no matter what Pacifier says. She's not like the Olympians, she's not like humans. This is highlighted many times in many different scenes, and that leads to stated loneliness. Even when she finds brief companionship with people like Hermes or Daedalus, she is still utterly alone at the end of it, and that's even before her exile to her island, but especially there. And yet, I never felt it. I never felt her loneliness, and it is a problem because it is the motivation for all of her actions. I read the words, but I do not feel them. And that's why it's so strange when she goes to such extremes for her man. I cannot feel it. I cannot relate it. I cannot feel that desperation for companionship from her. I couldn't relate to this loneliness, and I am lonely most days, so there is something wrong. And on top of that, I didn't particularly find Circe's story to be feminist. At one moment, it even reeked of plastic feminism when we learn why Circe turns men into pigs. And yes, totally understandable, but I didn't need that motivation for her. It is kind of sad still how much of her life revolves around men and their wishes. She always does things for them to appease that emptiness inside of her. But again, there was an opportunity here, a chance here to have her find that meaning inside of herself, maybe in her sorcery even, but it almost never is that, which is sad. To be fair, I like the resolution for her character at the end of the book here. I just maybe would have wanted a little bit more emotional investment from me to Circe, which never happened, which is a shame, but maybe it's a personal thing. I think I will reread the Odyssey and the Iliad before I attempt Song of Achilles. And I'm not watching the Nolan movie, it looks cursed. And that's it. 5 books, not many. But again, apologies for my stuffy nose. I will see you later in the month with Maxim Gorky, I think. That's the one I'm doing.